According to a 2022 survey, rock is still the #1 most popular music genre in America. But it wasn't always this way. Rock and roll didn't establish itself as a genre until the 1950s, and even then it was constantly being overwhelmed by the more popular genres at the time, like R&B or surf rock.
However, one band came and changed that. The Beatles, as a result of their unique attributes in songwriting, caused a turning point in the music industry by introducing a new wave of British rock and roll, decreasing the popularity of ghostwriting, and influencing pop culture with their massive fandom for generations to come.
In 1956, a man from Liverpool named John Lennon gathered a few of his musician friends and formed a skiffle band called the Quarrymen. At its start, the band consisted of Lennon and 3 friends. They attracted small-scale popularity and established themselves performing in fairly large British venues for events and other musicians. However, the Quarrymen never really took off.
On July 6, 1957, at a church party, fellow musician Paul McCartney was introduced to Lennon. Later that year, McCartney joined the Quarrymen as a guitarist and later a bassist. The following year, in 1958, George Harrison, a friend of McCartney, joined the band.
In 1958, the group made their first push toward rock and roll. This genre shift was not well received, especially among Quarrymen members themselves. Multiple original members disapproved of the new music and left the band. All that remained was Lennon, McCartney, Harrison, and a drummer, who was later replaced by Ringo Starr.
The new and smaller group changed their name multiple times before landing on the Beatles. Now the Fab Four, now known as the Beatles, has assembled. The time period in which the Beatles rose to popularity was a time of great change. In the United States, the 1960s saw great progress in the feminist movement, gay liberation, the civil rights movement, and general changes in how the public viewed the political system. The fact that the U.S. was undergoing all these shifts in culture opened up a path for there to be developments in music as well.
The UK was experiencing a time of economic success. The booming economy allowed society to flourish, especially in London, which was quickly becoming Britain's cultural hub. A stable economy meant that people had some extra spending cash, making it easier for teenagers to buy Beatles records. This greatly contributed to the Beatles' popularity. The Beatles began performing at a club called the Cavern Club, and multiple times in Hamburg, Germany. As young performers, the Beatles were troublemakers, but George Martin, a producer, and Brian Epstein, a manager, made them the polished band they became known as. George Martin signed the Beatles with Parlophone in 1962, giving them their platform. He additionally produced and arranged their self-written songs to be refined and commercially appealing. By doing so, he encouraged what was unusual for the time, songwriting done by the band members themselves. The new image also made them a new style of male role model, one that was a little less serious and a little more goofy and carefree.
Shortly after George Martin was introduced to the band, the Beatles began to take off. The Beatles' influence expanded worldwide. They performed in 15 different countries and 90 cities. Beatles music even cracked the Iron Curtain and made its way into the Soviet Union. The band is credited with introducing Soviet teens to the popular music of the non-communist world. Additionally, the Beatles' influence and power are evident in the way that they helped to heal the United States after the assassination of the American President John F. Kennedy. 18 days after the assassination, CBS aired a story about the Beatles on the evening news, despite the Beatles not having very much previous popularity in the United States. This CBS broadcast catapulted the Beatles into the States and kicked off a global sensation known as Beatlemania.
According to the Oxford Languages Dictionary, Beatlemania is defined as extreme enthusiasm for the Beatles as manifested in the frenzied behavior of their fans in the 1960s. In short, people went crazy for the Beatles. Despite the chaos of Beatlemania, the band continued to evolve in their music. Their music touched on multiple different subgenres of rock, from the soulful, groovy feel of the album Rubber Soul to the more experimental sound of the album Revolver. They even introduced the idea of the concept album, which is an album with an overarching theme and story, with the release of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band.
Unfortunately, all good things must come to an end. The Beatles broke up in 1970 and legally finalized the breakup in 1974. The band dealt with a share of controversy over this split. The members themselves had various conflicts, and millions of Beatles fans worldwide were very upset about it. Members of the fan base were jumping to conclusions and desperately trying to find someone to blame for the fall of the band, including John's wife, money, problems, and tension between the members.
They decided to start their own company, Apple. And they weren't businessmen. They just got in over their heads. And it was a mess, and it lost money. And it created, I think, tension in the band.
Even though the band may have broken up, the popularity and influence of the Beatles was still very evident. Each musician released successful solo music, and the Beatles' albums remained top sellers at record stores, eventually becoming the top-selling music act of all time. But their influence can also be seen outside of their own music and fans. The previously mentioned concept album, Sgt. Pepper, started a wave of concept albums being released. Some examples of modern concept albums are American Idiot by Green Day, American Gangster by Jay-Z, and Archandroid by Janelle Monáe. The idea of band members writing their own songs grew in popularity as well. The Beatles kicked off the fall of the role of the ghostwriter, or someone who writes music for a band without being in a band themselves. Before the Beatles, ghostwriters were the norm, giving musicians a more manufactured feel, but a notable decline in the prominence of ghostwriters began when the Beatles burst into the mainstream. This concept still exists in the modern music industry, but it is not as common, and that can be attributed to the Beatles. The group also produced in a way that combined new and old recording styles and placed an emphasis on teamwork and management. They also reintroduced the world to rock. The Beatles were incredibly popular, so as expected, many bands arose that aimed to sound similar to them in order to attract fans. The Kinks, the Zombies, the Rolling Stones, and the Who are all bands that gained popularity around the same time as the Beatles in an event known as the British Invasion. Many modern artists credit the Beatles as inspiration as well. Although the style of music popularized by the Beatles may not be as mainstream today, many artists still look to and credit their songwriting, album setups, or careers.
Modern artists such as Lady Gaga, Frank Ocean, Coldplay, Oasis, and more have all spoken about or sampled Beatles music. The sheer cultural influence that the Beatles had is strong enough to cross genre borders. So why are the Beatles such a big deal? How are they able to have a lasting impact in an industry that is constantly changing?
Yeah, I would say the artistic growth. The art that we talked about earlier, how they just keep evolving and keep changing and going in new directions, and that just kept them interesting. You couldn't put them in a box, right? They're in the cute sort of pop song box, and then they get into the more serious, Nowhere Man, Eleanor Rigby box, and then they get into the more creative.
On the other hand, there were also negative sides to the Beatles' popularity. As the band grew, so did the image of their drug use. The band was blamed for spreading and popularizing the use of multiple drugs, including LSD and other psychedelics. In certain crowds, the image of the Beatles became synonymous with the trippy, drug-related culture of the so-called hippies of the time. Parents became concerned with their image, especially after Lennon made a sacrilegious comment in 1966, claiming that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus.
Despite this, the majority of the Beatles' legacy remains positive. In fact, when the Beatles released previously unreleased music in 2023, it was extraordinarily well received and jumped to the top of the UK charts. In the short term, the Beatles helped heal the US in the wake of the assassination of JFK and built a massive fan base. They managed to remain relevant and succeeded in almost all aspects of their career. In the long term, the Beatles introduced a new wave of rock and roll and kick-started the influx of British bands into the US. They contributed to the end of ghostwriting and introduced a new form of role model. They changed the popular idea of what an artist should be with their unique personalities, and set the precedent that artists should discuss things like current events and religion publicly. The prestige of the Beatles was so powerful that nearly 60 years later, their impact can still be seen in music, from concept albums to covers to tributes.
The sheer influence of the Beatles is most visible in the way that their popularity has spanned across generations and decades, and their rise to fame marks a turning point in the history that lives on today. Their music, style, and character have made them uniquely timeless.